The porch light flickered twice before dying completely, leaving me standing in darkness at 11:40 p.m. That should have been my first warning. You know when you get that gut feeling something's wrong? Like when the air gets too quiet before a storm hits? That's exactly what I felt when I heard the heavy boots crunching up my gravel driveway. 3 men in matching navy jackets with Seaview Community Enforcement patches walked toward my front door like they owned the place. If you're watching Karenology, you know these stories never start simple. This one sure didn't. Mr. Bradshaw? The tallest one spoke without introducing himself. Thick mustache, clipboard in hand, the kind of guy who probably peaked in high school football. Emergency pool inspection. We've received multiple reports about sanitary violations. I rub my eyes, still trying to process. At midnight? Are you serious? Sir, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. The second guy was already walking past me toward my backyard gate, carrying some kind of electronic device that beeped every few seconds. Your choice. The smell of their cheap aftershave mixed with the autumn air made my stomach turn. These weren't real inspectors. Real inspectors don't show up after midnight with attitudes and mystery equipment. Hold on. I stepped between them and my gate. Let me see some identification first. Mustache guy flashed a laminated card so fast I barely caught the letters. Mr. Bradshaw, we can call the sheriff's department if you prefer, but I think you'd rather handle this quietly. That's when I noticed the white van parked across the street. Engine running, someone sitting behind tinted windows. This wasn't about pool safety. This was about something else entirely. Fine. I unlocked the gate, my hands shaking slightly, not from fear, from anger. But I want to see exactly what you're testing. The second guy was already kneeling by my pool, dipping his device into the water. The thing started beeping like crazy, red lights flashing. He looked up at his partner and nodded grimly. pH levels are critical, he announced, loud enough for the neighbors to potentially hear. Water chemistry is completely off. This is a public health hazard. I'd tested that water myself 3 days ago. Everything was perfect. Hell, I'd been maintaining pools since I was 16. First my parents', then my own, for the past 12 years since Sarah died. I knew when water was clean. That's impossible, I said, but they weren't listening. The third man, who hadn't spoken yet, was taking pictures with a professional camera, lots of pictures. The flash lit up my entire backyard like lightning strikes, and I caught glimpses of my neighbors' windows, curtains moving, faces peering out. By morning, half the neighborhood would think I was running some kind of toxic waste dump in my backyard. We'll need to file an immediate report, Mustache said, scribbling notes. You'll be hearing from the Homeowner Association within 24 hours. They packed up their fake equipment and walked away like nothing happened. No paperwork, no explanation, no real testing procedure I'd ever seen before. I stood there in my backyard, staring at my perfectly clean pool, feeling like I'd just been robbed, but couldn't figure out what they'd taken. That's when my phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown number. This was just the beginning. The porch light came back on by itself, casting long shadows across the water that looked like fingers reaching for something just beneath the surface. Have you ever felt like you're being hunted in your own home? The morning sun felt like an interrogation lamp when Karen Wilson called at exactly 8 a.m. Mr. Bradshaw, this is Karen Wilson, head of the Seaview Homeowner Association. Her voice had that fake sweetness that immediately put me on edge. I'm afraid we have some very serious concerns about your pool. I was still in my bathrobe, coffee mug halfway to my lips. Concerns based on what exactly? The inspection results from last night are quite alarming. pH levels dangerously high, filtration system compromised, bacterial contamination detected. She rattled off these problems like she was reading from a script. This poses a significant health risk to our entire community. That was complete garbage. My pool was cleaner than most people's drinking water. But Karen wasn't done. Fortunately, we've already arranged for a certified contractor to assess the situation. Tony Marino comes highly recommended. He'll be there within the hour. Wait a minute. I set my coffee down hard enough to splash. I didn't request any contractor. Mr. Bradshaw, this isn't optional. The association has emergency authority in matters of public safety. Tony will explain your options. The line went dead before I could respond. 53 minutes later, a silver BMW pulled into my driveway. The man who stepped out looked like he'd walked off a used car lot. Expensive suit, perfectly styled hair, smile that didn't reach his eyes. Tony Marino extended his hand like we were old friends. Dave, right? Man, I hate being the bearer of bad news. He glanced toward my backyard with practiced concern. But Karen filled me in on the situation. This is pretty serious stuff. We walked to the pool together. Tony pulled out a different testing kit than the midnight inspectors had used, but somehow got identical results. Funny how that worked. See, here's the thing, Tony said, crouching by the pool edge. Normal maintenance won't fix this. We're talking about a complete system overhaul. New filtration, chemical rebalancing, structural repairs where the contamination has set in. He stood up, brushing off his hands. I can have my crew here Monday morning. $8,000 should cover it. Maybe a little more, depending on what we find. $8,000 for a pool that was working perfectly yesterday. And if I don't agree to this? Tony's smile got tighter. Dave, I'll be straight with you. Karen's got connections at the county health department. Real connections. If this gets reported as a public health hazard, he shrugged. They'll red tag your property. No pool, no swimming, maybe even issues with your homeowner's insurance. The autumn wind picked up, scattering dead leaves across the pool surface. Each leaf that hit the water looked like evidence of neglect that didn't exist. I need time to think about this. Sure, take your time. Tony handed me a business card that felt expensive between my fingers. But don't take too long. These bacterial issues tend to spread, if you know what I mean. After he left, I tested my pool water again with my own kit. Same results I'd been getting for months. Everything perfect. Whatever those inspectors had tested last night, it wasn't my water. I was staring at the results when my neighbor Frank appeared at the fence. 70 years old, Vietnam vet. The kind of guy who notices everything and says little. Heard some commotion last night, he said quietly. Saw those men with the flashlights. Pool inspection. Apparently my water's toxic. Frank's weathered face creased into a frown. That's strange. My grandson Billy was swimming in there just last weekend when you weren't home. Kid's fine as far as I know. Wait, Billy had been in my pool? I'd never given permission for that. Well, Frank, when exactly was Billy swimming here? Week ago Tuesday. Saw him hop the fence around noon. Figured you knew. He paused. Should I not have let him? Tuesday. The day before Karen Wilson had called for the emergency inspection. That's when it hit me like cold water. Someone had been in my pool. Someone had contaminated it deliberately, knowing inspectors were coming. This wasn't about safety violations. This was about setting me up. Frank must have seen something change in my expression because he leaned closer to the fence. Dave, you need to know something else. That Karen woman, she's been asking questions about you around the neighborhood. Wants to know about parties, noise complaints, property values. What did you tell her? Told her you keep to yourself and maintain your property better than most. Frank glanced around like he was checking for eavesdroppers. As far as I know about that pool problem. Here, Frank spoke so quiet, as if the wind had ears. But Dave, what if someone's been to your pool intentionally? You got any idea who benefits if that pool gets torn out? The business card in my pocket suddenly felt heavier. What would you do if you realized your neighbors weren't just complaining? They were actively sabotaging you. The Emergency Homeowner Association meeting was packed tighter than a courthouse during a murder trial. 57 neighbors crammed into the community center, and I could feel their eyes tracking me like I was carrying the plague. Karen Wilson stood at the front podium, perfectly styled blonde hair catching the fluorescent lights, wearing a navy blazer that screamed authority. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, she began, voice projecting to the back row. Unfortunately, we have a serious health emergency in our community. A projector screen dropped down behind her. The first slide showed a photo of my pool, but something was wrong. The water looked murky, with green stains along the tile line that definitely hadn't been there yesterday. The timestamp read October 15th, today. But I'd been home all morning. When had someone taken this photo? As you can see, this contamination poses a direct threat to our children's safety. Karen's voice carried just the right amount of concerned authority. Bacterial levels are off the charts. One accidental fall, one moment of curiosity, and we could have a child in the emergency room. Mrs. Henderson from 3 houses down raised her hand. What exactly are we looking at here? Dangerous pH imbalances, possible E. coli contamination, and structural degradation that's allowing toxins to leach into the surrounding soil. Each word hit like a hammer. The county health inspector will be here Monday to issue a formal citation. That was news to me. No one had mentioned county inspectors when Tony Marino was trying to sell me his $8,000 solution. I stood up from my seat in the back. Karen, can I ask when these photos were taken? The room went quiet. 57 pairs of eyes swiveled toward me, and I felt like a defendant at his own trial. Mr. Bradshaw, these photos were taken this morning by our certified contractor during his assessment. Karen's smile could have frozen water. Perhaps, if you'd been more attentive to basic maintenance, we wouldn't be in this situation. Basic maintenance? Heat rose in my chest. I've been maintaining pools since I was 16 years old. That water was tested and balanced 3 days ago. Sir, please don't raise your voice at a community meeting, Karen interrupted smoothly. We're all adults here, and we need to address the situation with respect for everyone's concerns. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, aggressive. Another voice said something about property values. I sat down, jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. The next slide showed a map of our neighborhood, with my property highlighted in red, like a cancer cell spreading through healthy tissue. Now, the good news is that we have immediate solutions available. Karen gestured toward Tony Marino, who'd been sitting quietly in the front row. Mr. Marino has graciously agreed to prioritize this emergency repair work. Tony stood and turned to face the crowd. Under the harsh meeting room lights, his expensive suit looked even more out of place in our middle-class neighborhood. Folks, I'll be honest, this is one of the worst contamination situations I've seen in 15 years of pool remediation. His voice carried the practiced authority of someone who'd given this speech before, but it's definitely fixable. Complete system overhaul, new filtration, chemical neutralization of the contaminated water. Should have everything back to community standards within 2 weeks. Betty Carlson, whose backyard bordered mine, leaned forward in her seat. What about the smell? My grandchildren have been complaining about a strange odor when they play outside. What smell? There was no smell from my pool except maybe chlorine and autumn leaves. That's the bacterial decomposition, Tony nodded gravely. Very common in these cases. The new filtration system will eliminate that completely. More whispers, more worried glances in my direction. Karen stepped back to the podium. Mr. Bradshaw, we understand this is an expensive repair, but the association has emergency protocols for situations that affect community health and safety. Here it came, the trap I was walking into with my eyes wide open. If you can't afford the remediation costs immediately, we can arrange for the association to cover the expenses and add them to your monthly dues over the next 5 years. Karen's voice was honey over broken glass. All we need is your authorization for the work to begin Monday morning. 5 years of payments to fix a problem that didn't exist, for work I didn't want, by a contractor I didn't trust. And if I refuse? The room went dead silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to hold its breath. Mr. Bradshaw, refusal to address a documented health hazard violates Section 12.3 of our community covenant. The association would have no choice but to seek legal remediation through the county. Karen's fake smile never wavered. I'm sure we can avoid that unpleasantness. Betty Carlson raised her hand again. What happens to our property values if this isn't fixed quickly? Studies show that environmental hazards can decrease neighborhood property values by 15 to 20% within the first year, Tony answered immediately. But fast action limits the damage. The crowd was turning. I could feel it like a tide changing direction. These were my neighbors, people I'd waved to for 12 years, helped with flat tires, borrowed tools from. But fear makes people stupid, and Karen Wilson knew exactly which buttons to push. I need time to get a second opinion, I said. Mr. Bradshaw, Karen's voice hardened just enough to let everyone hear it. How much time do our children have before someone gets seriously hurt? The meeting ended with a motion to authorize emergency repairs if I didn't sign the authorization by Sunday evening. 43 votes in favor, 8 against, 6 abstentions. Walking to my car afterward, I caught Frank waiting by his pickup truck. Dave, that was a setup from start to finish. he said quietly, and I think I know why. Something cold settled in my stomach as Frank glanced around the parking lot, making sure we weren't overheard. But what Frank told me next changed everything I thought I knew about Karen Wilson's real plan. Frank's pickup truck smelled like motor oil and old coffee, but his voice was stone cold sober. Dave, 3 weeks ago, I was having a beer at Murphy's Tavern. You know the place, dark booths, locals only, the kind of spot where people say things they shouldn't. He glanced in his rearview mirror like we were being followed. Karen Wilson was there with some guy in a fancy suit, not Tony Marino, someone else. The parking lot was nearly empty now, just a few stragglers from the meeting, walking to their cars under the yellow streetlights. They were talking about your property, specifically about clearing the backyard obstacle for some new development project. Frank's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. The guy kept saying something about maximizing lot potential and 30% profit sharing. My blood went cold. What kind of development? Sounded like townhouses, high-end stuff. The suit mentioned your lot was perfect because it backs up to the community easement, extra space for parking and landscaping. Frank turned to look at me directly. Dave, your pool isn't the problem. Your pool is in the way. Everything clicked into place like puzzle pieces I'd been too stupid to see. The midnight inspection, the fake photos, the emergency meeting designed to pressure me into authorizing expensive repairs that would put me in debt to the association for 5 years. Frank, who was the guy in the suit? Never got his name, but he was driving a car with dealer plates from Wilson Premium Real Estate. Frank paused. Same last name as Karen. Think that's a coincidence? The pieces kept falling. Karen Wilson wasn't just the association president. She was connected to a real estate development company. My property, with its large backyard and pool, was preventing some kind of construction project that would make her family serious money. There's more, Frank continued. The bartender at Murphy's is my nephew Rick. He's got one of those security cameras behind the bar. Records everything for insurance purposes. Told me he might have that conversation on video if someone really needed it. A recording, actual evidence of Karen's real plan. Frank, would Rick be willing to... My phone buzzed. Text message from the same unknown number as last night. Stop digging or lose more than just your pool. Frank saw my expression change. What is it? I showed him the message. His face went hard. The kind of expression that reminded me he'd spent 2 tours in Vietnam. Dave, these people aren't playing games. They've got money, connections, and they're willing to break rules to get what they want. He started his truck, engine rumbling to life. But that also means they've got something to lose. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we get that recording before it disappears. Rick's working tonight. Murphy stays open until 2 a.m. on Saturdays. Frank put the truck in gear. Question is, are you ready to fight back, or are you going to let them steamroll you? I thought about Sarah, how she'd fought cancer for 2 years, with more courage than I'd ever shown in my comfortable suburban life. How she'd never backed down from anything important, even when the odds were impossible. Let's go get that recording. Murphy's Tavern sat on the rough side of town, the kind of place where construction workers and mechanics went to forget their problems. Rick looked exactly like Frank, same weathered face, same suspicious eyes, same way of sizing up strangers. Uncle Frank told me you might be coming by, Rick said, wiping down glasses behind the bar. Yeah, I remember that night. Lady was loud, talking about money and construction permits. Made me nervous. Do you still have the recording? Rick glanced around the nearly empty bar, then nodded toward a back office. Security system keeps everything for 30 days. But I gotta warn you, if this gets back to me, I could lose my liquor license. That Wilson family's got friends at City Hall. Rick, they're trying to steal my property through fake health violations. If I don't stop this, it won't end with just me. He studied my face for a long moment, then pulled out a flash drive from behind the cash register. This never came from me, and if anyone asks, you were never here tonight. The drive felt warm in my palm, like it was carrying fire instead of data. Frank and I drove back to my house in silence, both understanding that we'd crossed a line. This wasn't just about pool maintenance anymore. This was about exposing corruption, and people with money didn't like being exposed. Sitting in my kitchen at midnight, laptop open on the table, I plugged in the flash drive and found the file dated 3 weeks ago. The audio was clear enough. Karen's voice discussing removing the pool obstacle and fast-tracking the development permits once the backyard is cleared. The other voice, definitely her brother or business partner, talking about profit margins and construction timelines. But there was something else on the recording, something that made my hands shake as I reached for my phone. Karen Wilson wasn't just planning to develop my property. She was planning to take it completely. Have you ever discovered that your biggest problem was actually much worse than you thought? The recording kept playing, and Karen's voice got clearer with each terrible word. Once we force the remediation costs, he'll default on the association fees within 18 months. Standard foreclosure process after that. Her laugh was like ice cracking. The beauty is, it's all completely legal. Community health and safety violations give us emergency authorization powers. The other voice, definitely male, probably her brother, sounded impressed. And the county inspector? Already handled. Tom Morrison owes me 3 favors from the zoning board situation last year. He'll rubber stamp whatever Tony's report says. Papers rustled in the background. By Christmas, we'll own that lot outright. Demo the house, fill in the pool, and we've got space for 4 premium townhouses. My hands were shaking so hard I nearly dropped the laptop. They weren't just trying to make me pay for fake repairs. They were planning to steal my entire property. The house Sarah and I had bought together. The pool where she'd done physical therapy during her cancer treatment. Everything. I sat there in my dark kitchen, staring at the audio file, feeling like I was drowning. And then my phone rang. Tony Marino. "Dave, buddy, how are you holding up?" His voice carried that fake concern I was starting to recognize. "Listen, I know tonight's meeting was rough. People get emotional about their kids' safety." "What do you want, Tony?" "Look, I like you. You seem like a reasonable guy who got dealt a bad hand." The sound of a car door slamming came through the phone. "So I'm going to make you a one-time offer. Walk away from the property voluntarily, and I'll make sure you get fair market value. No foreclosure, no legal hassles, no damage credit." He was calling me at 12:30 a.m. to offer to buy my house. These people weren't even trying to hide it anymore. And if I refuse? "Dave, you heard the association vote tonight. Emergency remediation starts Monday morning, whether you authorize it or not. $8,000 now, or $80,000 in legal fees later." Tony's voice hardened. "Your choice." The line went dead. I sat there staring at my phone, rage building in my chest, like pressure in a boiler. These people thought they could terrorize me out of my own home. They thought I was just another weak suburban guy who'd roll over when threatened. They'd never met Sarah, and they didn't know what she'd taught me about fighting impossible odds. I called Frank. "Dave, what's wrong?" "They're not just after the pool, Frank. They want the entire property. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me." Silence on the other end. That recording, it's enough to prove conspiracy and fraud, right? Karen, Tony, even the county inspector are all in on it. "Should be," Frank said carefully. "But Dave, these people have lawyers and connections. Evidence doesn't mean much if the system's rigged against you." "Then we don't use the system." Another pause, longer this time. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking it's time to stop playing defense." Sunday morning, I was in my backyard taking photographs of my perfectly clean pool when Tony Marino's crew showed up. 3 guys with a truck full of equipment, ready to begin the emergency remediation that would put me $8,000 in debt. "Mr. Bradshaw, we need access to your pool area," the crew chief announced. "Association authorized us to begin work immediately." "No," I said simply. "Sir, we have a work order signed by the association president. This is a public health emergency." "Then you won't mind if I call the county health department to verify that emergency status." I pulled out my phone and started dialing. Should just take a minute to confirm with Inspector Morrison that he's actually scheduled to be here Monday. The crew chief looked nervous. Tony's truck pulled into my driveway, and he climbed out looking frustrated instead of confident. "Dave, what's the problem here? We're trying to help you." "I'll bet you are. Tell me something, Tony. When exactly did you become a certified pool contractor? Because I called the state licensing board this morning, and they don't have any record of your certification." Tony's fake smile disappeared completely. "Dave, you're making this harder than it needs to be." "Am I? Because I also called Inspector Morrison's office. Funny thing, He's been on vacation in Florida all week. Won't be back until Wednesday. The crew was already packing up their equipment. Unlicensed contractors don't like having their credentials questioned in front of witnesses. Tony walked closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You think you're smart? You think you figured something out? His breath smelled like stale coffee and desperation. This is bigger than you understand, Dave. Walk away while you still can. Or what? Or tomorrow you'll wish you had. After they left, I stood in my backyard holding the flash drive in my pocket, knowing I'd just declared war on people with money, connections, and a willingness to break the law. But what I didn't know yet was that Tony Marino had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Because threatening a man with nothing left to lose is like lighting a match in a gas station. Monday morning brought the kind of silence that makes you check if your phone's working. No calls from Karen Wilson, no text messages from Tony Marino, no crew trucks in my driveway. Just an autumn wind that rattled my windows like nervous fingers tapping on glass. I spent the morning making copies of Rick's recording and researching property law. By noon, I had 3 flash drives hidden in different locations, and a pretty good understanding of how Karen's scam was supposed to work. That's when Martin Gray showed up at my door. Martin was the association treasurer, a quiet accountant type who'd lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone. 60-something, always wore cardigans, the kind of guy who balanced his checkbook to the penny. He was also sporting a cast on his right arm that looked fresh. Dave, we need to talk. His voice was shaky, like he'd been drinking coffee all morning. Can I come in? We sat in my kitchen, Martin's good hand wrapped around a mug, while his cast rested awkwardly on the table. How'd you hurt your arm? I asked. Fell off a ladder 3 weeks ago. Stupid accident. He took a sip of coffee, then looked directly at me. Dave, I didn't sign that emergency authorization for your pool work. My blood stopped moving. What do you mean? The paperwork Karen presented at the meeting. It had my signature authorizing emergency association funds for health hazard remediation. But I've been wearing this cast for 3 weeks. I can't write my name, let alone sign official documents. Martin pulled a folder from under his good arm and spread papers across my kitchen table. Association bylaws, financial records, authorization forms. Here's my real signature from before the accident. He pointed to a document dated a month ago. And here's what appeared on Friday's emergency authorization. The handwriting was completely different. Same name, but the letter formations were wrong, the pen pressure was different, even the spacing was off. Martin, are you saying Karen forged your signature? I'm saying someone did, and there's more. He flipped through the papers with his good hand. I've been the treasurer for 8 years, Dave. I know where every association dollar goes. In the last 6 months, we've paid $45,000 to something called Municipal Consulting Services for unspecified advisory work. What's Municipal Consulting Services? Doesn't exist, at least not as a registered business entity. But guess who the payments are made out to? Martin's finger traced down the financial statement. M. Wilson. Karen's maiden name was Morrison before she married. The pieces clicked together like a lock opening. Karen had been stealing association funds through a fake consulting company. She needed a big project to justify the missing money, like an expensive pool remediation that would never actually happen. Martin, why are you telling me this? Because I'm not going to let her destroy this community to cover up her embezzlement. His voice got stronger, more determined. And because she threatened my grandson when I started asking questions about the missing money. My coffee went cold in my hands. She threatened a child? 8-year-old Tommy. Karen made sure to mention how dangerous it would be if he had an accident while playing in the neighborhood. Martin's jaw was clenched tight enough to crack teeth. That's when I knew this had gone too far. We spent the next hour going through the association's financial records. The pattern was clear. Karen had been systematically stealing funds for months, using fake invoices and forged authorizations. My pool crisis was just her way of creating a legitimate expense to hide the theft. Dave, we have enough evidence to send her to prison, but we need to be smart about this. Martin gathered up the papers. Karen's brother runs half the construction permits in this county. If we go through normal channels, evidence might disappear. Then what do you suggest? Martin smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. Tomorrow night's the monthly association meeting. Mandatory attendance, all members present. What if Karen discovered that her emergency pool project was going to cost a lot more than she expected? How much more? What if Tony Marino suddenly demanded $50,000 instead of $8,000, right there in front of everyone, with Karen having to explain why she'd already authorized payment from association funds that weren't supposed to exist? I stared at Martin, realizing this quiet accountant had just outlined a plan to destroy Karen Wilson in front of the entire neighborhood. Martin, Tony's not going to go along with that. He's part of the scam. Tony might, if he thought Karen was planning to cut him out of the real estate development profits. Martin's smile got wider, especially if someone happened to mention that she'd been calling him expendable in recorded conversations. The plan was risky, complicated, and required perfect timing, but it had one thing going for it that appealed to me more than anything else. It would let Karen Wilson hang herself with her own rope, right in front of everyone she'd been lying to. Tuesday evening, walking into that community center, I felt like a gunfighter heading into the saloon for a final showdown. What I didn't expect was that Karen Wilson had prepared a surprise of her own. The community center was packed again, but this time the energy felt different, electric, like everyone knew something big was about to happen. Karen Wilson stood at the podium, wearing her usual navy blazer, but there were stress lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. Tony Marino sat in the front row, but he kept checking his phone and wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. "Thank you all for coming," Karen began, her voice slightly hoarse. "As you know, we're here to finalize the emergency remediation of Mr. Bradshaw's pool contamination." I stayed seated in the back, Martin Gray beside me with his cast prominently displayed. Frank was 3 rows ahead, and I could see Rick from Murphy's Tavern near the door, our backup plan if things went sideways. "Unfortunately," Karen continued, "the situation has become more complex than originally assessed. Here we go." Tony stood up slowly, like he was walking to his own execution. "Folks, after further testing, we've discovered the contamination extends into the surrounding soil. We're looking at a complete environmental remediation project." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Betty Carlson raised her hand. "What does that mean exactly?" $50,000, Tony said flatly. "Minimum, maybe more depending on how deep the contamination goes." The room erupted. $50,000 was more than most people's annual salary. Karen looked like she'd been slapped, which told me Tony had gone off script. "That's impossible," Karen's voice cracked slightly. "The original estimate was $8,000. "Ma'am, environmental contamination doesn't care about estimates," Tony replied, and I realized he was enjoying this. Sometimes these things get expensive, real expensive. Martin chose that moment to stand up. "As treasurer, I have to ask, where exactly is the association planning to get $50,000? Our emergency fund has less than $12,000. Perfect timing. Karen's face went pale. We'll need to discuss financing options," she stammered. "What about the $45,000 that's already been paid to municipal consulting services?" Martin's voice carried clearly through the silent room. "Maybe we could reallocate those funds." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Half the room was staring at her. The other half was looking confused. "I don't know what you're referring to," Karen said finally. That's when I stood up, pulled out my phone, and connected it to the room's speaker system. "Maybe this will refresh your memory." Karen's recorded voice filled the community center. "Once we force the remediation costs, he'll default on the association fees within 18 months. Standard foreclosure process after that." The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on carpet. The recording continued, Karen discussing bribing the county inspector, Tony talking about profit margins, her brother planning to demolish my house for townhouse development. By the time it finished, Karen Wilson looked like she wanted to disappear through the floor. "That recording is illegal," she shouted. "You can't use illegally obtained evidence." "This isn't a courtroom, Karen," Frank called out from his seat. "This is a community meeting, and we just heard you admit to fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy." The crowd was turning ugly. 57 neighbors who'd been manipulated and lied to were all realizing it at the same time. Someone yelled, "Where's our money?" Another voice demanded Karen's resignation. Tony Marino was already heading for the exit, but Martin had anticipated that. Rick from Murphy's was blocking the door, arms crossed, looking like the kind of guy who'd spent time in less comfortable places than community centers. "Tony, don't you want to explain to everyone how this contamination testing works?" I called out. "Or should we discuss your non-existent contractor's license?" That's when Karen made her final mistake. Instead of trying to explain, instead of apologizing, instead of showing any remorse for what she'd put everyone through, she went on the attack. "You people are idiots if you believe him over me," she screamed. "I've been protecting this community's property values while he's been running a health hazard in his backyard." Wrong move. These weren't just neighbors anymore. They were people who discovered they'd been stolen from. The vote to remove Karen Wilson as association president was unanimous. The vote to turn over all financial records to the district attorney was 54-3. The vote to ban both Karen and Tony from all community property was 56-1. Karen cast the only dissenting vote. 3 weeks later, the county health department tested my pool and found it cleaner than the community center's drinking fountain. The district attorney's office filed charges for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. Karen Wilson's real estate development company went into bankruptcy. Tony Marino left town before the investigation was complete. I'm still living in my house, still maintaining my pool, still waving to my neighbors every morning. But something changed that night in the community center. These people aren't just neighbors anymore. They're allies who learned what happens when a community decides to fight back together. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm floating in my pool under the stars, I think about how Sarah would have handled Karen Wilson. She probably would have been more diplomatic about it. But I think she would have been proud of the outcome. The water's still clean. The pH levels are perfect. And the only contamination that ever existed was in the hearts of people who thought they could steal from their neighbors without consequences. Some things don't wash out easy, but some things shouldn't. If this story hit close to home, hit that like button. And if you've got a Karen in your neighborhood causing problems, drop a comment. Sometimes we all need to know we're not fighting alone.